This is the breakfast bar in my kitchen, and ever since we moved in, I've always thought it's a little bit dark on here, unless you put the main lights on and then everything is far too bright. So today I want to install 3 of these IKEA pendant type lights over the breakfast bar. However, just like most DIY, it's not quite that straightforward. You see, firstly, I think up there I've probably got a steel beam, so I'm not quite sure how I'm going to fix them to the ceiling. And secondly, I have no idea how I'm going to get the cable to them without it showing. Apart from that, it should be easy. So this is the main part of my kitchen, but it sort of ends here and then goes into like a conservatory. So there's a great big span with a wall above where we've got bedrooms above. So my thought is, where that span is, it's going to be a big blimmin' steel beam. So just screwing into the plasterboard to put these lights in might not be as easy as it first looks. So I think I need, before I do anything, a little bit of investigation. This is the first outing for my new endoscope, which I'm going to feed into the ceiling void via this downlight, which I take out in the traditional way. Ow. This is essentially a camera connected to a semi-flexible wire that uses your phone as a screen, and it can see into inaccessible areas or down pipes. You can see my complete review of this on my second channel called Proper DIY Tools and Stuff. Link is below for those of you that haven't found it yet. So as I thought, I've got a nice red oxide steel beam running along here. I would guess that it actually runs down the middle, so it picks up both skins of the blockwork. However, I think what I'm going to be doing is putting a board up here and then fix the lights to the board. So my next step is actually to drill a couple of holes just so I can see where the steel beam is, and then I'll decide whether I'm trying to fix onto the steel beam or the plasterboard either side. As the board I'm going to be fixing here will cover this whole area, I'm not too worried about drilling some holes in the ceiling. I need these so I can understand how far this beam extends out from the centre to see if I'm going to be able to get a fix in either side of it. So, after a few random holes, it looks like I'm definitely going to be fixing into steel, and there's almost no gap between the top of the plasterboard and the bottom of the steel flange. So there's no way of getting a cable from one light to another to the supply. So I'm definitely going to have to go down the plinth method or put in something on the ceiling to be able to hide the cable. And then I'm going to have to fix all of that to a steel beam. So in the workshop I ripped down 2 sheets of 18mm MDF so I can glue them together to make the board that's going to contain all the wiring and for the 3 lights to hang from. So this pelmet or plinth or whatever you call something that you stick to the ceiling, not sure what you call that, I'm going to make with 2 layers of 18mm MDF. I want to do that because I want it a little bit chunky, because the rest of the kitchen is a little bit chunky. So I don't want 18mm, I want 36mm, which I think will look right. And if I do it that way, it means I can cut slots in the top sheet of MDF so I can run the cables in rather than trying to get them up into the ceiling. And that will be covered by the bottom sheet, so you won't actually see any of the cables. And that means I can get cables from each light and right to the wall, and hopefully get it fed from the wall. So what I need to do is set out where the lights are going to go on one of these sheets, then cut some slots. And once I've done that, I can put the sheets on top of each other, glue them, and then I was going to clamp them, but actually the top one is going to be invisible anyway, so I can actually screw it, so I know that I've got a good connection and a nice tight joint all the way around the outside. I've cut these over size, so once they're glued and screwed together and everything's gone off, I can then recut them and I'll end up with a nice edge. Not quite sure what shape that edge is going to be yet, but if it's all nice and tight and then I cut it, I end up with a nice thick homogeneous plank. I lay out my new lights where I think they line up where the stalls normally sit and spend 5 or 10 minutes adjusting them and measuring until I'm happy with the layout. I can then transfer these positions to the top layer of my MDF sandwich so I can cut a slot just off the centre line for the power cables to run in. The slot for the cable, I don't quite cut all the way to the edge at this point, just so the board keeps its shape. I then give the bottom sheet a liberal covering of wood glue, put the two together and join them with screws. With the glue fully cured, I can cut the two boards to their final size by trimming one side using the factory edge of the original board as a guide, and then cut the other side using the first cut as a reference, so I end up with an exactly parallel board. I also cut the board square and to length with a plunge saw, making sure that I miss any screws. I've decided to put a very slight round over on the bottom edges of this board, just to match the other kitchen units, which I do with a block plane and just some sanding. Only at this point did I realise that the small amount of primer that I did have left has all dried up and is ruined. So I used something just as good, emulsion paint. If you don't know, you can use this successfully as a primer or undercoat on materials like this. While the paint is drying, I turn my attention to how to get my power cable from the top of the kitchen units to where the board is going to end up on the ceiling. And although my first thought was to cut a slot in the plasterboard wall, then put the cable in and cover up and make good, I thought I might be able to route it through the ceiling. So once again, I drill a couple of small holes just to investigate. So then I thought, if I can get a cable from the corner to the downlight hole, and then pull it from the downlight hole to where the board is going to end up, then I've essentially connected the two holes together, saving me cutting and repairing the plasterboard. So off camera, I shove a load of the cable up the first hole and then went looking for it with my endoscope, and it wasn't long before I found it, and I managed to hook it with the hook attachment and pull it back out through the downlight hole. So now, as long as I can get the endoscope from the final position of where I want the cable to be to the downlight hole, then I can pull the cable back with the endoscope, and it didn't take long before I managed to do that. Yo, hello. Come on, yo, yes. That makes me happy. So my original plan was to go from the end of the plinthy thing that I'm about to put up to the top of the cabinet there by essentially removing plaster, putting the cable in and then replastering. But because I've got my super duper endoscope and with this hooky thing at the end, now I've managed to get a cable from here on top of the cabinet all the way through to here by going up into the cavity at the top. I could have never have done it with this because you just can't see what's there. You just can't maneuver and get past all the bits and pieces in the ceiling here. So that just saved me an awful lot of work. With the plinth primer stroke emulsion dry, I can now mark out and drill for the light hooks and where the cables are going to come out adjacent to them, and then paint the first coat of the final colour, which is anthracite. And for a change, this is full fat, high VOC, good old fashioned oil-based paint, which unlike the modern quick dry and water-based paints, goes on like a dream and rolls to a great, slightly stippled finish. With the paint dry and some mounting holes drilled around the perimeter, I can pop in the cables from one light position to the other, holding them in place within the slot at the back with some masking tape, and then attempt to get this thing, that I must say is a few kilograms now, fixed up above my head onto the ceiling. I first connect the power cable to one end and then using my pair of plasterboard props, force the board up onto the ceiling. So now I need to fix this board through the plasterboard and into the bottom flange of the steel, which I think is probably going to be about 10 to 12 mil, getting on for ½ an inch thick. Now, there's various different ways of doing this. The best way, if you can actually get to the flange, is to drill a hole and then use a nut and bolt, just like you would have seen me do when I was putting a wall on the front of my garage to make it into a workshop all those years ago. However, if you're in a situation like me where you can't get to the top of that flange and put a bolt in, there's two other methods. The first method is to drill a hole and then use a screw that's slightly bigger to force into that hole and hope that it bites. You probably only get one chance. A more professional way of doing it is to use what they call tech screws. Now, these are screws that have got, they're not only self-tapping, but they're self-drilling. So it's essentially a screw with a drilling bit on the end. So that drills a hole all the way through the steel. Then the thread takes over. It threads itself, and then now you've got to fix in into your steel. Now, there's a couple of things you need to know about these. First of all, there's standard duty and there's a heavy duty. These are the heavy duty ones because I'm going into a structural steel beam. And secondly, that drilling bit at the end there needs to be at least as long as the steel, thickness of the steel you're going into. So I'm going into 10 or 12 mil steel. This is a 12mm bit. If not, before you've actually drilled the hole all the way through, the thread wants to take over and then it gets snagged and it all goes terribly wrong. These are tech screws. The make of these ones are Tech Fast. I got these off of Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below. And let's just hope they take. The manufacturers recommend a speed of 1500 to 2500 RPM for these tech screws. And after about 30 seconds of drilling, I managed to get through the bottom flange and the screw bites, fixing the board up onto the ceiling. If you've got any concerns about drilling into steel beams, which obviously each time reduces the load bearing capacity of that beam just a very small amount, definitely get it checked out by a structural or civil engineer before you start. As the plasterboard has now been slightly pushed up, a couple of nail pops appear near the board, which is to be expected. So I just remove those, tighten up the screws and fill. Just in case I ever want to take this thing down, I protect the head of each fixing with a little bit of masking tape, just to keep the filler from surrounding it totally. And then I use a 2-part filler to fill the holes, as I want it to go off as quickly as possible so I can continue working and not to shrink in the meantime. So it doesn't take long before the paint is dry and everything is 100% complete. And it's as if they've been in the kitchen forever. And I am really happy with those. They're exactly the right colour and the right size. And they produce a sort of bit of a break between this part of the kitchen and the other side. And using the IKEA controller as well means I can dim the lights, so I can change the mood depending on what's happening in the kitchen, and obviously turn them on and off as well. So that, I think, is a good job done. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I will see you next time.